This is Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2, an NES title born from one of gaming's oldest and most legendary unsolved mysteries. Gaming history is filled with games that were cancelled before their time. Everyone can probably name a few of the recent ones, like Star Wars 1313, Silent Hills, and Mega Man Universe. Or even some of the older ones, like I'm still waiting on Time Splitters 4 and Zone of the Enders 3. The sad fact is that sometimes games get hyped up in the gaming media, only to be cancelled under the weight of development delays, studio closings, or even bad PR. Hey there folks, John here from Biddy Kong's Quest, and today we're going to cover one of the oldest and most legendary video games that never saw the light of day. It's a story that spans decades, and it even spawned another entirely different video game that nobody expected. This is the story of Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2, and there's a lot to cover. Here we go. Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1 is a lost Famicom game, which first appeared in the June 1989 issue of Video Games and Computer Entertainment, listed in an advertisement for a mail-order video game company called Play It Again. Later that fall, an October listing for Funko, another mail-order video game service, added it to their listings, the difference being that they dropped the first Yeah and just left the game's title as Yeah Beebiss 1. Both lists, however, wrongly alphabetized the game between WrestleMania and Xenophobe, which suggests a connection between the two listings for the game. Both Funko and Play It Again were basically the 1980s equivalent of, like, GameStop. You would look at their catalog, sell your old games, and then you would buy pre-owned ones in return, all through the magic of the Postal Service. Now, it all seems antiquated by today's standards, but these companies would basically compile their lists of games from games that were either already out, or games that were going to be localized or released in the near future. Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1 appeared on these lists, and gamers assumed that meant it would be coming soon. It even had a price next to the listing. Information that, in theory anyway, had to come from somewhere official. But in January of 1990, the listing for Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1 suddenly disappeared from the catalog, and it was never seen again. So here you have a game that seems like it came from an official source, but with no screenshots or even a story summary to back it up. When games usually were localized from Japan, they would often receive name changes, but it's usually possible to trace a game's localized name back to its original one. There would usually be something in like a gaming magazine or an interview or something. But in the case of Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1, nothing was ever printed and no clarification was ever made. The game just vanished. The first mention of Yeah Yeah Beebiss that I can find after it disappeared from the Funko and Play It Again advertisements is in a Google Groups post from 1994. So this tells us that this is an old mystery. People were wondering about what happened to the game even a few years after the listings were first posted. So the question that we're left with is, what happened to Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1? Was it a joke, or maybe a misprint? Did it become another game entirely, or, was it just flat out cancelled? The internet has spent decades trying to figure this out, and there's a lot to cover. But I'm going to try to give it to you guys in a nutshell, because in order to understand Yeah Yeah Beebiss and the mystery and how far we've come, we need to understand how we got there. These are the theories. Before we get into the bigger stuff, we need to talk about another subset of theories, and these are the ones that basically state that Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1 was either made up, or it was an inside joke, or maybe even a placeholder game for something else that was going to be on the list later. The problem with these theories is that they're basically unprovable. And since they're unprovable, they're not super fun to talk about, because in order to actually prove any of them, you would actually have to have the direct input of the person that made the list in the first place. And while it has been confirmed by Andy McNamara, who used to work for Funko, that the creators of the list did fabricate game titles on occasion, there's nothing to suggest that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I was specifically one of those made-up titles. So with those out of the way, let's look at another popular theory about the listing for Yeah Yeah Beebiss I, the copyright trap. The idea behind the copyright trap is that companies like Play It Again would sometimes publish fake information in their listings so that it would be easy to catch other companies that may have been copying their lists. Now, this may sound absurd, but this is actually pretty common practice. In fact, a lot of documentary-style YouTube channels employ this tactic in order to guard their content from being stolen by other content creators. Those who have been around the YouTube gaming community for a while might remember when the huge YouTube conglomerate WatchMojo ripped off a video by Larry Bundy Jr., who was a smaller creator. Larry was able to prove that WatchMojo copied him because WatchMojo included a fact in their video which Larry completely made up, as a trap for those that might try to copy him. So as soon as that fact appeared in WatchMojo's video, it was pretty obvious what had happened. There might even be a few of those copyright traps in a video like this one. Maybe. In Yeah Yeah Beebiss I's case, the argument here is that Play Again fabricated the title as a copyright trap, listing it in the wrong alphabetical order by placing it between WrestleMania and Xenophobe, as I mentioned earlier. Since Funko's listing, which was printed months later, also misalphabetized the game the same way, this theory suggests that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I was a copyright trap and that, well, it worked. Of course, while this could be true, one still has to ask what real purpose this would have served for Play It Again, other than to prove somebody else copied their list, and maybe protect the research that went into compiling that list in the first place? It's worth noting too that the lists are also slightly different from each other, with Play It Again listing a few games that are left out of the Funko one, and so to a lot of folks this one seems a little bit too simple, and frankly, I agree. Now, all the theories so far have had one thing in common, and that's the fact that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I, whether it was a hoax or a trap or just made up or whatever else, it didn't actually exist. And if that's where you want to stop and you want to go on with your life, then I wouldn't blame you. But if you're still with me and you want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, then buckle up, because we are just getting started. Now, before we get into what might have happened to Yeah Yeah Beebiss I, let me first remind you about how these lists were compiled in the first place, because it's gonna matter later. Remember, Play It Again and Funko would often compile their lists of games not only from American titles which were readily available, but also Japanese titles which were slated for localization to the US. Most of the theories that follow revolve around the idea that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I was in fact an unlocalized but pre-existing game whose title was butchered in translation. Now, there have been a lot of candidates that have been considered for the title of Yeah Yeah Beebiss over the years, but I'm gonna give you guys the big ones. So, without further ado, these are the candidates for Yeah Yeah Beebiss I. The earliest mention that I can find of Yeah Yeah Beebiss I being an unlocalized Famicom game comes from the now defunct Nintendo Age forums. And in those forums, a user named Luigi Master came up with an idea while trying to translate the Beebiss part of the title.
I looked up the Romaji for what I assumed would sound like BB Sue and plopped it into Google Translate. It was translated as the BB. I decided to look up what BB meant, but dictionary.com thought I meant BB and Behold. BB was the surname of an American explorer and naturalist, and I decided to piece things together. The 1 probably was taken from the Roman numeral 2 as a typo, and the fact BB was an explorer, maybe YYBB1, turned out to be Super Pitfall 2.
For those that don't know, Super Pitfall 2 was an unreleased localization of a Japanese title called Atlantis no Nazo, or The Mystery of Atlantis. It was a relatively popular early Famicom game that could possibly pass as a sequel to the admittedly pretty rough Super Pitfall on the NES. It's a really fun game that honestly can maybe be a little bit too cryptic at times, but you know what? It's actually pretty fun, and if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend doing so. But regardless, Activision eventually decided not to go through with the localization on this game, so it never made the trip west. There's also an interesting footnote to this theory. According to an article on highscoreesports.com, someone named It's Joker Time responded to Luigi Master's forum post, claiming that his father had given him a prototype copy of Yeah Yeah Beebiss I that was shown at the Consumer Entertainment Show in 1987. This was proven to be a hoax, however, as the 3-screw cartridge shell used in the picture wouldn't have been in use until after the CES show in 1987 that it was supposedly found at. Now that's about it for this theory, and honestly the connection is tenuous at best. But we had to start somewhere, and honestly this one paved the way for a lot more complex theories that would come after it. So let's look at the next one. In July of 2016, Yeah Yeah Beebiss got its first comprehensive coverage in the form of a YouTube video by user LSupersonic While this video is not considered up to date anymore, it still exists and I highly recommend a watch. Even 5 or 6 years ago, it's impressive how much work had already gone into deciphering this mystery. But getting back on topic, in the comments section of LSupersonic video, fans got their first new theory in years about the identity of Yeah Yeah Beebiss I. And that came in the form of a comment by YouTuber The Cyaninator about a Japanese Power Pad game called KYONSHIS. And by the way, I've never had any training in Japanese, so I'm probably butchering that title. But you guys will just have to forgive me for the rest of the episode because it's probably not the last Japanese thing I'm going to have to say. Anyway, here's the quote.
Here's Bebi spelled out in Japanese. Now, here's the number 1 in Japanese. And here's a page with the box art on it. Now let's look at the text on the box. Bebi, written on the box in Japanese as this, looks practically identical to Bebi 1, which would be written like this. How easy would it be for an American, reading through a long list of Japanese game titles, to see this and misread it as this?
So, if the Rai is taken as a Japanese substitute for Yeah Yeah, then KYONSHIS becomes Yeah Yeah Beebiss I, with a Roman numeral 1 being used in place of a numerical value. Now, it's worth noting that some people have taken issue with this theory, and other ones too, because Rai was a Japanese-only title, and it showed up in an American list of games. However, it's pretty clear that these listings also included other Japanese titles, because you have things like Dragon Ninja, which is actually the Japanese equivalent to what we got in America as Bad Dudes. So these lists clearly included games from both regions. And on a side note, I should tell you guys that I was unable to find this or the Super Pitfall 2 theory in their original places of origin because the Nintendo Age forums are unfortunately gone, and also the YouTube comment by the Cyaninator seems to have been deleted from LSupersonic video, and I was unable to track that down. However, both were cataloged in a Reddit post in 2018, and I've linked it in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. Now, we've still got a few more theories to talk about, but before I move on, I should note that Rai is still widely accepted as one of the best candidates for Yeah Yeah Beebiss I's existence, and this isn't the last time we're going to hear about it. But that said, let's move on to the next one, which, oddly enough, wasn't even an NES game. Candidate number 3 is, in my eyes anyway, the least likely of all of them to have been the real Yeah Yeah Beebiss I. However, a lot of folks seem to see merit in this theory, so I felt like it should be included. This theory revolves around an unreleased Game Boy game that first appeared in a catalog by game publisher Vic Tokai in 1989, right around the same time that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I first appeared in the Play It Again listing. The game's name was DWEEBERS. Now, I'll readily admit, the name DWEEBERS does sound a lot like Beebiss, but that's basically where the similarities end. So, the title DWEEBERS is clearly missing any kind of correlation to the Yeah Yeah part of Yeah Yeah Beebiss I, and it doesn't even contain any numbers. But the real nail in the coffin on this theory for me is that the Funko and Play It Again listings all listed NES and Famicom games, not Game Boy games. Additionally, there are records that DWEEBERS itself would eventually be renamed to Gatherers. and only a couple of prototype images ever made it out of development before the project was cancelled entirely. So despite some surface level similarities, DWEEBERS doesn't really fit what we're looking for here. Lastly, I should note that most of this information came from a blog by a guy named Chris Byanek that is unfortunately no longer available. However, I was able to access it via the Wayback Machine, so I'll leave a link in the description below, and I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in more information about this lost game. After the DWEEBERS theory came and went, the trail went cold for a couple of years. The theories about Yeah Yeah Beebiss I's true identity were pretty exhausted, and it seemed like the community had given up on finding any kind of definitive answer to one of gaming's oldest mysteries. That is until March 2021. When a Lost Media Forums user, and we'll just call this person TGAH since we usually keep this a family-friendly channel, reignited the mystery with a forum post entitled "Me Rambling Incoherently About Yeah Yeah Beebiss I." In this very long and very detailed post, TGH laid out a pretty convincing theory that Yeah Yeah Beebiss I might actually have been localized in the US after all. So could we have had this mystery game with us all along and not known it? Well, TGAH seemed to think so, and according to this theory, only one game fits that bill. That game is Yo Noid. Now, before we get into this theory, let me remind you just one more time that Funko and Play It Again would often include Japanese titles in their listings in the event that they would get localized, like we talked about with Dragon Ninja eventually becoming Bad Dudes. TGAH's theory speculates that the Yeah in Yeah Yeah Beebiss was a mistranslation of the word Yo in Yo Noid, and that Funko's later decision to drop one of the Yas in their list was a correction to reflect the singular Yo in Yo Noid's title. Additionally, the theory speculates that the mysterious Roman numeral 1 at the end of the title is a mistranslation of the exclamation marks, and that Beebiss is, oddly enough, a mistranslation of the word pizza. Since Domino's Pizza was localized in the game, and let's be honest, what Japanese person would even know what a Noid is since it was exclusive to the US? The timing lines up pretty well too. Kamen no Ninja, the Famicom game that eventually became Yo Noid, was released in 1990. And since it could take over a year for a game to be localized from Japan, this would place Funko and Play It Again's listings right in the middle of the game's development cycle. Then, in November of 1990, when Yo Noid came out in the West, Play It Again and Funko may have realized their mistake and removed Yeah Yeah Beebiss I from their listings in time for their January 1991 issues. Now, to me anyway, this is one of the most convincing theories just because the time frame seems to line up pretty well, and also the translation errors are somewhat believable. Still, I know it's a stretch, but it's less of a stretch than a lot of other theories that came before it, and honestly, in my opinion, it's about on par with the Rai Rai theory. The Lost Media Wiki forum thread spans an impressive 44 pages, and it's an incredible deep dive into some serious theory crafting about this mystery. Over the course of this discussion, the thread also discusses more candidates like a Famicom baseball title called Yakuban. And theory crafting has continued even as recently as February of 2022, as forum users continue to look into other games, such as the return of Donkey Kong, as candidates for Yeah Yeah Beebiss I's identity. If you want a summary of where things stand, I highly recommend checking out a video by All Things Lost that goes even more in depth than I did. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check it out. Now, that was all a ton of information with plenty of twists and turns along the way. And honestly, the story of Yeah Yeah Beebiss I probably isn't even over yet. But let's get back to the reason that we started this video in the first place. We're not just here to talk about one of the most infamous unreleased video games of all time. We're here to talk about its sequel. Enter Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2. Created by YouTuber John Riggs and published by veteran homebrew developers MegaCat Studios, Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2 is a spiritual successor to the mythical Yeah Yeah Beebiss I. And just in case you've never heard of John Riggs, he's a longtime YouTuber who releases tons of videos regarding game hacks and reproductions, including tutorials on how to make your own reproduction games. Now, longtime viewers of my channel will know that I am very much into DIY reproductions as well as homebrews, even to the point where I exhibited a speedrun of the Cowlitz Gamer's second adventure, which is a homebrew, at AGDQ 2021. And John's channel is honestly a huge reason that I got into that scene in the first place. If you're looking to get into these sorts of things, John's channel is an excellent place to start, as it has some great tutorials on how to get started. With all that in mind, it goes without saying that John's technical abilities plus his deep love of retro gaming make him perfect for a project like this. But where did the idea come from in the first place? I mean, this is John's first homebrew release, and so why did he choose this project as his debut? Well, in order to get the answer, I just went and asked John himself. Here's what he said.
The game was never meant to be a sequel to any game, really. What happened was, when MegaCat Studios and myself started chatting back and forth, talking about game design, okay, single screen, arcade platformer, 2 players simultaneous, I kind of threw out there, it's like, well, wouldn't it be funny if this game was Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1, just so there would be one? But then I had that gut feeling of like, well, maybe I shouldn't. I don't want to lie to anyone by saying that this game is Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1, and I don't want people to get the wrong idea. So I'll do the sequel to it, and we'll call it good. And I think it worked out pretty well.
Now, it's important to note that this wasn't a solo project. John had help from one of the biggest names in the homebrew development space, MegaCat Studios. Some of their more well-known titles are games like Coffee Crisis, Little Medusa, Logjammers, and Tanglewood, all of which are excellent games. The studio even has their own cartridge collection for the Evercade, which I think most people in the retro gaming space are probably familiar with at this point. And it's an awesome console if you haven't checked it out. To put it simply, these guys are all about facilitating opportunities for independent developers to get their games out there. And honestly, their mission statement says it all. We are all gamers, collectors, and enthusiasts first. We love creating games. From retro cartridges to PC and current generation consoles, we want to make games that are accessible and enjoyable for every gamer. This mission made the folks at MegaCat the perfect partners to help John Riggs tackle the Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2 project. While he could provide the concept, contribute graphical ideas, and help with marketing, they could handle the programming legwork and some of the logistics of distribution. And the professionalism on both sides is clearly reflected in the quality of the product. So without further ado, let's take a look at the game itself. Yeah Yeah Beebiss 2 is a traditional arcade-style platformer where you control one of 2 Chinese ghosts, as they banish evil spirits from a graveyard. It is your quest to banish evil in all 10 levels before facing a mutated mass of pure evil, the boss to end all bosses. In practice, both characters' attacks are virtually the same, so your choice mainly comes down to visual preference. To hear John himself tell it,
the theme and character direction, I think, came from when we first started chatting about it, the game being Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1. So they looked at that badly translated Famicom game, I believe it was a Power Pad game, that features the Jiangshi, the Chinese jumping zombie vampires. That was one of the ideas of where Yeah Yeah Beebiss 1 came from, was to use those characters. And I thought it was a great idea, and so we went for it.
Once you're in the game, enemies spawn at random points throughout the screen, and it's your goal to eliminate the requisite number of evil before the time runs out. It's a pretty simple setup, and it's pretty addicting too, as some levels can get pretty tough. Jay over at Square Pegs and I both agree that level 7 especially can be rage-inducing. But I could actually see some potential for a speedrun here in the future as well. Graphics were primarily done by the folks at MegaCat Studios, and they honestly look great. The colors are awesome, the sprite work is really good and really sharp, and the enemy designs are pretty creative and they look great. There are some screenshots from early in the game's development that feature John Riggs himself in the lead role, but unfortunately those were cut from the game before it was released. Now, longtime viewers of the channel will know that I absolutely love my chiptune music, and this game is no exception. The music for this game was composed by John Riggs' friend, Chips and Cellos, and it stands out as some of the most unique music that I've ever heard come out of an NES's sound chip. I've always wanted to compose 8-bit Mega Man music, and the initial idea behind Chips and Cellos was to try something different and cover classical music pieces in that familiar Capcom style. And Chris from Chips and Cellos was not kidding. You've never heard classical music like this before. And that's about it as far as the game itself. But before we wrap this up, I wanted to address one of the pitfalls that homebrews and hacks sometimes run into. Will it play on actual hardware? In the interest of being thorough, I tested the cartridge in an original NES, a Retron 1AV, which uses software emulation, and an NT Mini Noir, which uses hardware or FPGA emulation. And after all that, I'm pleased to say that this game works great on all three of those systems, and I feel pretty confident that it's going to work great on whatever system you decide to play it on. John has also made an NES version available for those that want to pick up the game physically. In addition, a Dreamcast version has also been made available by Wave Game Studios, and I'll leave links to where you can get those in the description below. And the game was recently released on the Nintendo Switch eShop as well, so there are a lot of options if you'd like to give it a shot. That said, if you're interested in some of those physical versions, you might want to jump on that soon, as a lot of them are already selling out. On a final note, if you're a fan of John Riggs, then you're in luck, because it sounds like we may be getting even more games from him and Mega Cat Studios in the future.
I partnered with Mega Cat Studios. What happened was, they had a homebrew that they released before they were Mega Cat Studios, and I've known them a long, long time. I've known them since before Mega Cat Studios, the people there. So I reached out to them asking if I could basically buy the ROM and the rights, and that's when Mega Cat Studios said, oh, you know what, you've covered our video games in the past, you've always promoted us and everything. Just for you, just this once, let us code you a new homebrew that you can use as you please, and whatever you want. We're gonna code the game for you. We'll help out with the graphics, and we'll send it to you. And whatever you want to do with it, it's yours to do from there. And I thought I was floored. I was like, I'm not going to turn down that idea. So we did that. Worked out great. And a little exclusive for you. We the two of us are already working on Mega Cat Studios and myself the next game that we're making. Now this will be a Mega Cat Studios title, but I'm helping them. I'm working with them on this one, and that one's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to that. Probably more of that later on in 2022.
This turned out to be an absolutely fascinating topic for me to research and discover. From the deep history of the Yeah Yeah Beebiss I mystery to the creative endeavors that resulted from it. But the thing that strikes me the most about this whole thing is the sheer number of people that have contributed to this saga over the years. This entire story is a testament to how collaboration by people who start out as random strangers on the internet can lead to lasting friendships and incredible experiences as we craft our stories, together, as a community. It has been an absolute pleasure sharing this story with all of you, and we'll be back again. But until then, like, comment, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, and I'll see you all next time.